She married a penniless cowboy. He secretly owned 3 cattle ranches and a silver mine. The morning she agreed to marry me, she was watching a grasshopper work its way up the window glass of the Deming land office, and she said, without turning around, "I want you to know I'm not expecting much." I told her that was fine. "I mean it, John. I've heard what people say, that you're a fool with money or that you never had any. Either way." I told her I'd heard the same. She turned then. 41 years old, dark circles she didn't bother to hide, hair the color of turned earth pinned back the way a woman pins hair when she's got better things to think about than hair. She looked at me the same way she'd look at a horse she wasn't sure she trusted, but was going to ride anyway. "I've been poor before," she said. "After Frank died, I know what it is. I'm not afraid of it." That was the thing about Clara Marsh. She wasn't afraid of much. I said, "I know you're not." She nodded once, turned back to the window. The grasshopper had made it to the top of the glass and didn't know what to do with itself now that it had. She watched it a second. "Then let's go sign the paper," she said. "I need to back up some. My name is John Stratford Connolly. I was born in the territory in 1839, 47 years before this story catches up to itself. My father came out of Tennessee with a mule and a bad temper and built something in the Mimbers Valley that would have been called modest if you were being generous. He died when I was 14. My mother was half Navajo and didn't survive the winter that followed. I want to say I was taken in by someone kind, but the truth is I was taken in by a man named Elias Dorn who needed someone to clear rock and didn't want to pay for it. I left Elias Dorn when I was 17 with $14, a horse I'd bought off him over 2 years at 50 cents a week, and about as much feeling in my chest as a fence post. Now, most men who come from nothing and end up with something, there's a story in the middle. A stroke of luck, a hand dealt right. Mine wasn't clean like that. There was work, and there was work, and there was a particular kind of stubbornness that other people sometimes call vision, but I'd call stubbornness. I drove cattle up the good night-loving trail twice before I was 23. I knew grass. I knew water. I could read a piece of land the way a minister reads scripture, not because I'd been taught to, but because I'd been made to need it. The first stretch I bought was 1,200 acres in the Animas Valley, 1868. I paid 11 cents an acre, and it took me 4 years to save what that cost. I did not tell anyone I'd bought it. That's not a thing I can fully explain, the not telling. Part of it was that telling invites opinion, and other men's opinions had never done me any good. Part of it was something older and harder to name. Where I came from, having something meant someone could take it. So I kept what I had the same way I'd kept myself alive as a boy, quietly. The Animas land went to grass the way I knew it would. I sold cattle off it in 73 and 74 and put that money into a second piece outside Silver City. Then a third, bigger than the other two together, down toward the Boot Heel. And in 1879, a man named Collier who owed me a favor cut me in on a played-out silver claim he was about to walk away from. And when I had it drilled proper, we found the vein he'd missed. By the time I moved into Deming in 1884 to keep an eye on the rail shipping, I had more money than I'd ever had reason to count. I kept a room at a boarding house on Pine Street. I wore the same kind of clothes I'd worn at 17. I ate at the counter at Ruiz's Cafe and didn't give anybody any particular reason to think otherwise. It wasn't a performance, exactly. It was just how I knew to be. The person I'd built was lean and self-contained and didn't need anything from anybody, and I didn't see a reason to change that. But then, Clara had come to Deming 6 months before our wedding. She was the widow of Frank Marsh, who'd run a small freighting operation out of Las Cruces until 3 years prior when his heart quit on him during lunch. She'd sold the wagons and mules and paid Frank's debts and had enough left to start over somewhere that didn't have Frank's ghost on every corner. She took a job keeping accounts for the feed merchant, Hobart, because she was good with numbers. She rented the East Room at Dora Kelleher's boarding house, which was the same boarding house I lived in, which is how we met. The first time I paid her any real attention was a Tuesday evening in October, cold coming on early, when I was sitting on the boarding house porch with my boots off, because I'd walked a long way that day and my feet were arguing about it. She came out the door with a book and sat down at the other end of the porch and didn't say a word to me for a long time. The lamp inside threw a yellow rectangle across the boards between us. I could hear horses down the street, and something frying in somebody's kitchen, and nothing from her at all. After a while she said, not looking up from her book, You've been in that chair since before supper and you haven't moved. Are you all right, or are you just thinking very hard? I said I didn't do a lot of hard thinking. She turned a page. Most men say that. I said most men mean it. She looked up at that, studying me the way she'd do later with that horse that might bite. Then she went back to her book. That was it for maybe 2 more weeks. Porch conversation. She read, I sat. Sometimes we talked about the weather or about something she'd seen in the street, or she'd say something dry about one of the other boarders and I'd answer dry back, and that would be the whole thing. I didn't plan anything. I don't know that I plan things. I notice things and I move toward them, or I don't. I noticed that she laughed at things nobody else thought were funny. That she argued with Hobart about his ledger columns in a way that said she was right, and she knew it, and he knew it too. That she'd given her good wool coat to a woman begging outside the mercantile and come home in October cold in just a dress and not mentioned it. That when the drunk on the corner got ugly with a girl from the south end of town, Clara Marsh walked over and told him something in a voice I couldn't hear, but that emptied his face of everything it had been full of. I didn't think I was falling in love with her. I thought I was just noticing. Dora Kelleher told her. That part still makes me feel a particular way. I wasn't there. It was a Wednesday in November. Dora, who was not a woman given to minding her own business, told Clara over the breakfast table that John Connolly had been in love with her since October and wasn't going to do a thing about it because he was the stubbornest man she'd ever had under her roof. Clara told me this herself later. She said she had looked at Dora for a moment and then said, "Well, that's inconvenient." She did not mean it as a compliment. Or, she didn't mean it as the kind of compliment a woman says when she wants a man to know. She meant it straight. It was inconvenient because she had not come to Deming to find anybody. She had come to Deming to be left alone, and she had been left alone by everyone except this weathered, quiet man who didn't say much and seemed to mean what little he said. And now apparently he was in love with her, and she was going to have to figure out what to do with that. She said she thought about it for a week, and then she walked over to where I was sitting on the porch one evening and said, "Dora says you have feelings in my direction." I said, "Does she?" "Do you?" I looked at her for a while, cold night, our breath showing. "Yes," I said. She nodded, looked out at the street. "You haven't done anything about it?" "No." "Why?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I don't know that you'd want me to." She was quiet a minute. "I'm not saying I do. I'm saying I'd like to know what you'd do if I did." And that opened something up in me I hadn't expected. Not warmth, exactly. More like a door swinging on a hinge that had been still a long time. I said, "I'd ask you to take a walk with me and see if you wanted another one after that." She took the walk. She wanted another one. By January, she was letting me carry her things to and from the feed merchant, which for Clara Marsh was practically a declaration of deep feeling. By February, I had said things to her at night in the cold that I had not said to anyone, ever, about the territory and the mule and Elia's Dorn and the $14 and what it had taken and what it had cost. She listened. She didn't say much in the way of comfort, and I didn't want comfort. But once she put her hand briefly on my arm and left it there, and that was enough. In March, I asked her to marry me. I said I wasn't a wealthy man. That was the sentence I used. I wasn't lying. I was doing what I'd always done with what I had, keeping it quiet. And I told myself it was fine, it didn't matter, because she'd said she wasn't afraid of being poor. She said yes. We were married in April. Small ceremony at the town clerk's office, 2 witnesses, no dinner afterward because neither of us wanted a dinner. We walked back to the boarding house, and Dora had put flowers on the table in the front room and cried about it, which Clara said was exactly like Dora. For the first 3 months of our marriage, I kept the life I'd kept. My room became our room. I continued to eat at Ruiz's and continued to dress without any particular effort. My money continued to live in the places it had always lived. The bank accounts in Silver City and Santa Fe, the land records at 3 county courthouses, the mine partnership filed under Connolly and Collier in the territorial office, and none of that touched our daily life in any visible way. I don't think I was testing her. I want to be clear about that. I think I was just afraid, maybe, in a way I couldn't name. Afraid that the thing she'd chosen was the lean, quiet man on the porch, and if she found out about the rest of it, something would shift. That she'd look at me differently. That I'd become something other than what she'd married. I'd been invisible my whole life. It was the only skin I knew. It came apart on a Tuesday in July. We'd been over to Silver City for 2 days because I had business. I said business. She didn't ask what kind. And on the way back, the axle on the rented buggy cracked outside of a little nowhere town called Hanover. We got it to the livery, which was run by a bald man named Pate who knew me. Here's the thing about Pate. He was not an unkind man, but he was also not a man who kept information inside himself with any reliability. He came out of the barn, looked at the buggy, looked at me, and then looked at Clara and said, "Mrs. Connolly, you and John need anything while you're waiting. Got water and shade. The wife'll be glad to have company." Clara said that was kind. Pate said, "John, you hear anything back on the Silver City assay?" I said I hadn't. He nodded to Clara, conversationally, the way men make conversation when they're not thinking about what they're saying. "Second vein off the main shaft. I heard they're saying it might go deeper than the first one. Be something if it does." He went back to looking at the axle. Colton over in Lordsburg said the Connolly Collier mine was already the third best producing in the territory this quarter. Clara didn't say anything. We stood there in the sun. Pate got interested in the axle and started talking to his boy about what they'd need. I was looking at the ground. I could feel Clara beside me the way you feel weather coming. After a minute she said quietly, "John." I said her name back. The third best producing silver mine in the territory. A horse inside the barn shifted against a post. "Flies." "Yes," I said. Another minute went by. She said, "Is there anything else I should know about?" I told her all of it, standing in the dirt outside Pate's livery in Hanover, New Mexico, in July heat with flies and the sound of Pate's boy dragging equipment across the barn floor. I told her about the Anima's land and the Silver City piece and the Boot Heel Ranch. I told her about Collier and the claim and the second vein they'd just hit. I told her the numbers. I was looking at her face while I said it, and her face didn't move much. When I was done, she was quiet for a while. She watched a dust devil come up off the road and spin out against a post. Then she said, "You let me say I wasn't afraid of being poor." I said I had. "You let me mean it, and you married me knowing I meant it about a version of you that wasn't." She stopped, started over. "You let me choose you when I thought you had nothing." I said yes. "Why?" And here is the thing I told her that I'd never said out loud before, that I don't think I'd even fully known before the words came out. Because I wanted someone to choose me, not what I have, just me. The dust devil was gone. Pate's boy had stopped dragging things. Clara looked at me for a long time, not the horse that might bite look, something else. Something I'd seen move across her face in winter evenings and never been able to name. She said, "You understand that what you just said makes me furious." I said I did. "You made a fool of me." I said that wasn't what I meant to do, that I'd been afraid to tell her, that I'd been keeping things close my whole life because keeping things close was how I'd stayed alive, and I hadn't figured out yet how to stop. She looked at the road for a while. Then she said, "I chose you when I thought you had nothing. I want you to understand what that means." I said I did. "I don't think you do." She turned and looked at me straight, the way she always did when she wanted me to hear something past the words. "It means I'm not going to leave now because you have something. I'm not a woman who leaves over money. But John," she stopped. Her voice was even careful, the way she got when she was working hard to stay that way. "You let me believe something, and I built my life on what I believed. What I believed was, this is a man who has nothing and chose to be honest about it. And that man, that particular man, was who I married." "He's the same man," I said. "Is he?" "He's exactly the same man. The rest of it is just, I didn't have the word. Land, rock, numbers on a paper somewhere. I'm still the man on that porch." She was quiet a long time. Long enough that Pate came out and said the axle would take till morning and we should stay at the widow Rios's place up the road. She rented rooms. Clara said thank you. Pate went back in. We were alone. She said, "Why did you tell me you weren't a wealthy man?" "That night in March." "Because I wasn't telling you I had nothing. I was saying it didn't make me wealthy in any way that mattered." She stared at me. Then she let out a short breath through her nose that might have been the beginning of a laugh or might have been disgust. I couldn't tell. "That's the most bent-up piece of logic I've ever heard," she said. I said probably. "You couldn't just tell me." "No, because you've never told anyone." No. She looked down at her hands. She was wearing the plain ring I'd given her, thin band, not much to it. She turned it once around her finger. I'm not leaving, she said. I want that to be clear. I said I heard her. But I am going to be angry for a while. I said that seemed fair. She looked up, and I want to see it, all of it. The ranch is the mine. I want to know what I'm actually married to. You're married to me. John, her voice caught just a thread and she steadied it. You're the thing I chose, I know that. But the rest of it is yours, which means it's mine too, and I've been walking around Deming for 3 months not knowing what I own. I would like to know what I own. That was the moment I started laughing. I don't know if I can explain why. It just came up out of me, quiet and helpless, and she looked at me like I'd grown a second head. But then she was laughing too, a little, unwilling, and then fully. And we stood there in the July heat outside Pate's Livery in Hanover, New Mexico, laughing like two people who didn't entirely know what they'd gotten themselves into, but weren't going to get into it. We stayed at the Widow Rios's that night. Supper was postle and peppers, and Rios's daughter kept looking at us from the kitchen door with the particular fascination children have for adults who are obviously in the middle of something. After supper, we sat on the widow's porch in the cooling dark. Clara had her hands around a coffee cup. I was leaning on the railing looking out at nothing. She said 3 ranches. I said yes. And a mind. Yes. And you wore the same vest every day for 6 months. I looked down at the vest. It's a good vest. She made that sound again, the almost laugh. Then, tell me about the land, the first piece. So I told her, the Animas Valley, 1868. 11 cents an acre, the 4 years of saving. The way the grass grew up and I'd known it would. She listened the way she always listened, not performing interest, just actually there, following it. I told her about the Silver City Stretch and the Boot Heel Ranch, how I'd read each of them before I bought them, the way you read a thing you've decided you're going to love. She asked questions. Real questions, not polite ones. What's the water situation on the Boot Heel? Who manages the Animas when you're in Deming? Are you running crossbreeds or straight longhorn? The stars came out over the Hanover flat, and I talked about land for maybe 2 hours, and she sat there in the dark asking the right questions, and it came over me slowly, the way real things do, not a sudden knowing but a gathering, that I had never talked about any of this with another person. Not once. For 20 years I'd built and tended and measured and weighed, and never said a word of it to a single soul. And now I was saying it to this woman on a stranger's porch, and it felt like putting something down I hadn't known I was carrying. At some point she moved her chair closer and set her hand on my arm, the way she'd done once in February in the dark. She didn't say anything. She just kept it there, her hand warm and still against my sleeve. I stopped talking. The night sounds filled in around us. I said, you really aren't leaving. I told you I wasn't. I know, I looked at her hand on my arm. I'm not used to anyone staying. She was quiet for a bit, then, I know you're not. She kept her hand where it was. After a while she said, not unkindly but plainly, the way Clara always said things, you should have told me. Yes. You should have trusted me. Yes. You're going to have to get better at that. I said I was going to try. She turned her hand over, folded it into mine. She looked out at the dark the same way I was looking at it, both of us facing the same direction. I picked a broke cowboy, she said, because I liked who he was. Turns out I picked a wealthy man who was pretending to be broke because he wanted someone to like who he was. She squeezed my hand once, short and certain. I still like who he is. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. We went back to Deming the next morning. New axle on the buggy, sitting close because the seat was narrow, which was not a thing either of us commented on. In August, we rode out to the Animas land. All 3 ranches, one after another, 4 days on the road, staying in ranch houses and one very bad hotel in a town I'll not name because the food was insulting. She looked at every acre the way she'd looked at the feed merchant's ledgers, seriously, with intent, like she was going to be asked questions on it. At the Animas, she walked the fence line in the morning before breakfast, just walking, and I watched her from the porch. The grass was good that year, heavy and tall, moving slow in the early wind. She stopped once and crouched down and put her hand flat in the grass and then stood back up and kept walking. When she came in for coffee, I asked what she thought. She said, the northeast corner's going to waterlog in a wet spring. You've got a drainage problem you probably already know about. I said I'd been meaning to address it. She said, it's not hard to fix. And I found myself smiling at my coffee cup in a way that I didn't try to stop. That fall, she took over the books for all 3 ranches. She also, without asking me, and without any argument I was going to win, sent back a set of accounts to the mine that she said were being managed by a man who didn't understand ore grades, and she was right. She was nearly always right about numbers. She'd been making other people's numbers right her whole life, and now she had a set of numbers worth making right, and she did it with a kind of focused pleasure I recognized, because it was the same feeling I got from reading a good piece of land. In November, we went to Silver City, and I showed her the mine. She stood at the top of the main shaft with her hat in her hand, and looked down into it with an expression I couldn't read. She said, "How deep does it go?" I said, "The second vein, we don't know yet." She nodded. She was looking down into the dark. She said, "What do you want to do with all of it?" I said I hadn't thought much about it, that I'd spent so long just building it that I hadn't thought much past the building. She said, "Well, start thinking." And then she looked at me sideways, not the horse that might bite look anymore, just Clara, the woman who'd chosen me on a boarding house porch when she thought I had nothing. "We should start thinking," she said. "It's ours." That was the word that hit me. Not me, finally, after all those years of keeping it the only way I knew to keep anything. Ours. She said it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and I suppose for her it was. She was my wife. What was mine was hers. It just had never been anyone else's anything before. I didn't say anything for a moment. The sound of the mine working below us, the distant ring of iron, somebody calling across the yard. I said, "Clara." She was already looking at me. I said, "I'm glad it was you." She didn't get soft about it. She put her hat back on, smoothed her coat with both hands, businesslike. But before she turned back toward the mine office, she looked at me with something in her face that she never put into words because she didn't need to. It was plain, simple, she saw me. The whole of me, the $14 and the 14-year-old and the vest and the second vein and all of it. And she was still right there, not going anywhere. I am 63 years old as I am telling you this. We have been married 16 years. The Anima's land went to Gus, our oldest, 4 years ago. The Boot Heel Ranch we still run together, Clara and me, though her hip has been troubling her since last winter and I do more of the riding than she does, which she tolerates and complains about in equal measure. She fixed the northeast drainage problem the second spring we owned the place. She was right, it wasn't hard. There's a porch on the back of the Boot Heel house that faces west, and in the evenings when the work is done, we sit out there the way we sat on Dora Kelleher's porch in Deming 30 years ago, except now we have better chairs and we don't have to bother about being quiet for other boarders. Sometimes she reads. Sometimes I just sit. Sometimes we talk about the cattle or the books or something one of the children said. Sometimes we don't say anything at all for an hour at a time. The other evening she looked over at me and said, out of nothing, the way she does, "That vest finally wore out." I said it had. Dora would be horrified that it took this long. I said Dora had been horrified by plenty. She smiled. She has a good smile, Clara. She always had a good smile, but in the early years she kept it close, which was fair. She'd had reasons to be careful. Now she lets it come when it comes. She said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" I said I didn't. "That grasshopper." I looked at her. "At the land office," she said. "The morning we signed the paper. It climbed all the way up to the top of the window glass and then just sat there, not knowing what to do with itself." I remembered it. "I think about how I felt watching it," she said. "I thought, there's the both of us, climbed all this way and not sure what happens next." I thought about that for a while. The west light was going orange and flat over the grass, long shadows coming off the fence posts. "Did you figure out what happened next?" I said. She looked at me with that plain look, the one that doesn't need words. "Yes," she said, "I think I did." She reached over and put her hand on mine the way she had on the Widow Rios's porch in Hanover, New Mexico. In the summer we were young enough to think 16 years was a long way off. Her hand warm and still and certain. The grass moved in the evening wind. The shadows stretched out. That was enough.